Welcome to The Essential Element, the Elements of Education podcast. My name is Christian Page. I'm your host. Grateful that you chose to be here with us today. You could have chosen to be anywhere else in the world, but you're choosing to spend your time with us. We are interested in changing the face of public education. Today, our special guest is with a friend named Jen. Jen is a teacher who teaches math and aviation. Jen is passionate about instilling confidence in students, talks a lot about her impact in the school, and also talks about giving to the future generations through a girls' summer camp focused on STEM. So our conversation was inspiring. I hope that you enjoy it as much as we enjoyed having it. Without further ado, here's our friend Jen.
Our school, we really believe in relationships, and that is emphasized through mentor group. And so I wholeheartedly believe in that.
What do they need? I have to be able to answer that question. And that takes a little bit of time.
The biggest teacher, I think, is failure. The brain works in failure. And those failures are actually synapses rewiring themselves in your brain.
And think about where you want to be. Because when you find your place, you find your people. And our purpose is attached to people.
You know, when there's a phenomenal teacher, when there's a phenomenal educator, when there's a phenomenal mentor, one of the mistakes that we make is we make it look too easy. Like, everyone sees the shining moment on stage. No one sees, right, like the hard time spent. All right. Grateful to have the opportunity to be with you all today. Excited to see you again, and excited to welcome Jen to the podcast. And so, for our friends who have not yet met Jen, Jen is a teacher at IDEA. She teaches math and aviation, is passionate about community, has served in the United States Air Force, and has a storied history around community that she's going to bring with us to the podcast today. So, Jen, if you can tell our friends a little bit about who you are, about how the thread of community has existed in your story.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Jen Flonacher. Like Christian said, I'm a math teacher at IDEA, and I teach aviation as well. I think I have a pretty long history. It was a very long journey to get into teaching for me. It started really back in about 1998. I went to the Air Force Academy, left a community that I was really, really deeply embedded in, and went to this whole new community. And then from there, I spent about 16 years in the Air Force. I flew C-17 aircraft. I did a number of different positions. I was a graduate of the United States Air Force Weapons School, which is like the Air Force equivalent of Top Gun. I was only the third female to graduate in my weapons system, so that was a really interesting moment for me too. And then I left the Air Force to take care of my family, and went through a number of different careers, trying to find something that fit. I worked at Amazon for a while, did product management and planning, and then I went to a consulting firm, went back into aviation where I felt like I belonged, and then left there and took on a new opportunity with a startup in Seattle, using drone technology to replant forests, led their operations team for a while, and then decided that teaching was my passion. I'd done it in the Air Force. I wanted to go back to it. So had a midlife crisis and went back and got another master's degree, and ended up here. And I'm really, really grateful to be at IDEA. Awesome. So, and in terms of kind of community, I think to me, community is everything. That's why we exist, right? We exist because of other people and for other people, and to be a part of something that's bigger than ourselves. So community is a really, really deep thread in my own values.
I love that. And I'm curious about, you said, I went back to aviation because that's where I felt like I belonged. And now you find yourself at IDEA, right? Experiencing a sense of belonging. I'm curious, like, what has you experienced a sense of belonging at IDEA?
I think at IDEA, it's really what drew me in the first place to IDEA was this idea that there was a community, and it was built around these pillars of empathy, community, thinking, and balance, and people that believed that education was more than just the content you learn in classes. And that all coming together and being able to be a community of people that are there for the purpose of learning is really, you bring those things together, and it's like wrapping all my core values into one. So I think when you can find a place that matches your values, that brings out the best in you, then stay there, right?
Yeah. I love just thinking about the idea of belonging and finding a sense of belonging. I think it's so hard for teachers sometimes to try to think that that's part of their job, right? Like our job is to teach content and we hope that kids find a space in that. But before you can, as a student, and I'm curious about how you've experienced this in your life, before you can really engage in content, how hard is it to try to learn concepts, to try to succeed in a professional or educational environment if you don't have that sense of belonging? If you battle with the sense like, do I belong here? Do I fit? I
don't think you can. That's a core principle, right? If you don't feel safe in an environment, you can't learn. Like that's the way our brain systems and structures work. So, and my own personal example is I left high school. I was that student with a 4.0 GPA that was captain of this team and did this and that and super involved in all these community assets. I left my family, my team, my friends, and I went to this new place, this new environment where generally women weren't accepted, or if they were, it was because they assimilated into the norms of that community and the way that worked for them. And so that process of learning to assimilate really it was challenging for me, and I didn't succeed at first. I actually failed pretty miserably. And it took 2 or 3 years to kind of build up that, like to develop that network, that friendship, those connections that would enable you then to be successful and as a part of that community.
Absolutely. Well, and I wonder how many times, so you talked about this experience where you were part of a community, you were successful academically, working in the context of belonging, moving to a place where you didn't have a sense of belonging and struggled to succeed. I wonder how many times we would look at kids or work with students that are coming into an environment where they don't feel like they belong, and when then they don't succeed, we put that back on them.
We do, and it's invisible, right? Nobody can see it. So how do you support kids in that way?
Yeah.
Knowing that we don't know whether they feel like they belong. We don't know whether they feel like they're safe.
Right.
And yet we have a responsibility to be there to support them in a way they need, not the way we need.
Right, exactly. And there's so many things we push on top of that, right? Like there's this big push of resilience or grit. Like, we got to develop grit, right? That's what's really missing. The kids they just don't have that grit or determination to succeed. And especially when you talk about STEM, right? They can't persevere, and that's what we really need to instill. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. I think it's important to develop perseverance and learn how to overcome things. But we ignore the source of the struggle.
Yeah.
Right? The source of the struggle comes from this place of, I don't connect, I don't belong, and I'm spinning out here trying to find a place, and that's where I'm struggling, not because I'm not able to grasp the concepts, not because I don't work hard, it's because I don't feel like I belong.
And I think I heard once, one of my favorite sayings that I took away was that like grit is important, but when all you know is grit, it no longer is important, right? So if all you know in your whole life is grit, which there are kids with identities that is all they know, there's nothing at the end of it. And then what value does grit have?
I would think you're always in survival. And if I can have the soapbox for a quick second.
Go, soapbox.
One of the things that's interesting to me is that oftentimes I hear people talking about grit and perseverance, and the people who say it the most are the people who have had to have it the least. Right, and it makes me really upset, right? Because it becomes a proxy for students underperforming, right? And I often tell folks in that situation is that you can't expect grit or rigor for someone who you don't support. I think there's a very small sliver of individuals who have been able to grit themselves into, you know what I mean, some kind of position of success that didn't have someone in their corner, whether it be a singular mentor, whether it be a community of folks where they had a sense of belonging. Like if there's nowhere where you can lay your head, you know what I mean? Right? Like at some point, you transform into a version of yourself that is built on survival. And to your point, I don't think that that's of value to the community. Yeah. Right? And in institutions, in any of those places, like when you see high performing people who are also terrible human beings, right? And I hate to laugh about it, but and sometimes we get decorated for those things, but ultimately you have a terrible impact on culture. And if we ask people to replicate that, like I think we're asking to replicate the wrong thing. So I agree with you. Like, grit needs to exist, and I think it should be a byproduct of, you know what I mean, the level of support that people experience.
Yeah. So how do we combat that? Like I think we all agree, right? Like that's what gets blamed. So what do you do then? Like when you're building a community, and I mean, that's what school is, you're creating an intentional community. I personally believe that one of the powerful aspects of public education is that it's one of the few times in life where you bring people from all these different walks of life into a place where they have to learn how to be in community together, and you have to learn how to participate and create a sense of belonging in a diverse community where everything else in life is slowly putting people into categories, right? It's like almost our culture is like a long process of filtering and sorting, where like by the end, you're in this very insular group that looks just like you, and it's really hard to break out of that. And so one of the cool things about public education is that it's one of the few times in your life where you're going to be surrounded by people that are very different from you. So how do you create a sense of belonging in that? Like, how do you use that as a tool to teach, like, belonging has to be intentional? You have to engage your community. How do you instill that? How do you build that?
I think you hit the key word on it, is that you have to engage. You can't be passive in it. It's not a passive act for teachers. It's not a passive act for students. It's not a passive act for administration. So everyone has to intentionally engage.
Yeah.
So whether it be in a mentor group, whether it be through programs that you facilitate as a school and a community, but you have to be intentional and you have to actively engage in that process. Mm-hmm. So I know one of the ways that we have done that at IDEA is through our Girls STEM Camp. Mm-hmm. We have been, so if we back up to the history a little bit, last year during our January term, our mini term, another teacher, Mari Tirsch, and I embarked on a social innovation mini term where we were actively getting our students to engage in this process of social innovation and igniting change at a local level that could have a global impact. And one of the outcomes from that was the noticing that there was only 13% girls at our STEM-centered school, right? And that almost identically matches industries and the industries that we feed through our school. So that doesn't happen by happenstance. That happens intentionally, maybe not at our level, but at a systemic or a societal level that happens. And so we made a choice to actively combat that within, the constraints of the power that we have. And we're doing that. We are inviting elementary, middle school girls into our schools, into the walls of our schools, with our students as leaders and guides and our teachers as supports, to engage in STEM activities, to make these girls feel like they belong in STEM, get excited about STEM subjects, and then also know that by them being in it is really impactful. It makes a difference. And it changes the dynamic of it, not just for numbers, not just by the numbers of people that are there, but their perspective and the things that they bring with them are really valuable and can really change and innovate the industry.
Yeah. So this is fascinating to me because we're talking about this idea of sorting, right? And the 13% you're talking about that exists at IDEA, it would be easy to say, oh man, there's something we're doing wrong here. It should really reflect the larger Tacoma community, and that's the only problem. But the reality is that the sorting had already happened. And it already happens because, like you said, it matches pretty typically what happens across the board at all age gaps in STEM fields, from elementary all the way until PhD, and in the professional world, you look at the same percentages and it's consistent. So where is that sorting happening? Like, where is that 13% filter? Like, where's the bifurcation of those two roads? And what I hear you saying, which is powerful, is we have to go back to second or third grade to go, that's where the sortings happen. That's where the intervention needs to happen. That's where the engaging needs to happen to alter the size of each of those roads so it's not 13% anymore.
And it's not a one-stop shop. You can't hit a second grader and say, okay, they're going to be great till they get to IDEA.
Yeah.
You have to continually hit them and create that sense of belonging that they can continue to be a part of. Mm-hmm. All the way through their journey, right? It doesn't ever end.
Yeah.
So because you can have the best community in the world, and then you can go into a new community, and if you don't still have those supports, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
It can still impact you in the same way.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about there was a preface to this question, or like a bit of a preamble that exists there about like the sorting hat, for lack of a better term, right? I hear, right, you saying I was one of three. I hear you also saying 13%. And I know that my lived experience has been, right, that like whatever sorting hat was the expectation, like I didn't necessarily end up with. And so I'm hearing, right, twofold, right? Like, how do we change that current? But I think the question I'm curious about is like, and how do we equip, particularly in your case, right, young women who are going to navigate this space, right? That don't end up in the space that Zach was talking about, like where people look like me, where people act like me, where people move like me. But you named one of three. We're like, how do we equip, and while we're still trying to change how this looks, how do we equip those who are following that road to be successful and experience sense of belonging, even when the community doesn't look like them?
And I think that idea of equipping, for lack of a better word, is a really important one, right? Because we have to equip them on multiple fronts. One, we have to equip them to enter the world that currently exists, while simultaneously equipping them to change that, right? To move towards this world that we want. And so that's a really challenging thing to do. And I've noticed that with, even with our students of color in particular, like they are in this world, they're assimilating into, and I use the word they, and maybe I shouldn't, but I've noticed with my students, a lot of times, I'm doing this because you told me to do this. And really it's, okay, I'm preparing you for the world that exists out there. But at the same time, I want you to realize that what you bring is valuable and what you can offer is probably even more valuable. And like, there is a world that's better than this. And we want to prepare you to change it and make those changes and realize you are empowered to do that. So how do you do all of that at once?
I don't think you can do it at once. That's the hard thing. It's
maybe not at once, but
stages.
But simultaneously, right? Because you have to do both. You have to prepare them for all things over the course of the time that we can impact their lives.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I more think of like, how do you intentionally build community first with a student to make them feel like they belong? And like, I'm speaking out of turn here because this has not been my experience. I'm speaking of like a white male. So I've, in the academic world, especially in STEM, have never experienced that personally. Like I do match the profile of someone who belongs. And so I recognize that like my own bias towards that is one of trying to understand and not having that personal experience. But I feel like it would be hard to tell a kid, to tell a young woman, to tell a person of color, you need to change this. That burden's on you, when what they really want to do is just feel like they belong and succeed. Like, how do you balance that burden of like, I just want to succeed in STEM. I really like, writing code. I just want to be in computer science. I'm not out here to try to shoulder the burden of changing the industry. I just like doing this. Can I just find a place to belong? So how do you balance that blend for someone that feels like they have to then shoulder the burden of being the diversity hero instead of the person that just wants to succeed?
And that's a challenge that we actually faced, that idea. So Mari and I tried to create a social innovation club, and on the surface, it seemed like a great idea, but it was the same 5 to 10 students that were continually shouldering the burden of these changes at the school. And what we found is that they were then missing opportunity to do the things they came to the school to do.
Yeah.
So exactly. I think that's a challenge that we haven't solved yet, right? But it's something that we have to consider. And so my big push has really been like, how do we get everyone to shoulder the load in the same way? And that starts with understanding the impact, which goes back to this foundation of community, right? And empathizing with our community members.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because that's kind of what I was getting at. Like, it's not just the burden of the kids that you're preparing to go into this world that's not diverse. It's the burden of everyone recognizing that's what it means to engage community. Like, if you are someone like me who represents the dominant majority, it's your responsibility to engage community just as much. Like, it doesn't fall on the people who, the individuals who don't feel like they belong. It falls on all of us. And that, to me, is some of the more powerful aspects of teaching intentionally engaging community through mentor group. Is like, yeah, it's beneficial for students that are a representative of the minority, but it's just as beneficial for everyone else who is part of the majority to recognize it's their responsibility to make change too.
Absolutely. I wonder this, right? Because I think about your opinions on this, right? Like, I know that in my world, the way that I've operated is that the things that I believe determine my behaviors, and my behaviors over time will determine my results. And I'm curious, like, what do you think the core values have to be for community, for people who are not impacted by said thing to want to be involved?
Yeah.
With like, what beliefs do they have to hold? Like, what do we have to get young people, I don't even want to say get young people to value. What do we want to model as the core values that we have to hold in order for a community to move in that way?
to me was one word that comes to mind, and that's empathy. And that's why I think of those two pillars just as going hand in hand. You can't have empathy without community. You can't have a community without empathy. So it's understanding the perspectives and, almost being able to walk in someone else's shoes, or at least understanding what it's like to walk in your shoes. And that's hard. I think that's hard for students. It's hard for teachers. And it's hard, especially as a mentor, to facilitate with a group of 20 to 25 students in one room that are all very diverse, very different, with very, very different backgrounds. But
yeah, and I'm curious. So I like what you said, Christian, where you're saying your values determine your actions and your actions determine your results, basically, to summarize poorly. You said it much more eloquently. But I also wonder if it can also work backwards, because in my experience working with kids, sometimes if you try just to go with their core values, it becomes a little intimidating and overwhelming, and kids get like, whoa, what are you saying I'm a racist? Are you saying I'm, not inclusive? And sometimes if you focus on the behavior, say, let's just try this behavior and see if it seeps back into your value system. Like, I'm just thinking practically, how do you teach this? I think practically teaching listening, like creating scenarios in a mentor group where you are giving someone else the opportunity to say, it's not your job to speak, it's your job to listen and understand. And how many times can you try to listen and hear someone else's perspective? And maybe over the course of a semester, over the course of a year, that process of listening and giving space for listening will lead you to develop empathy. Like, is that possible?
I think this is where norms in a community can really play a big piece too. And that's one of my big focuses this year is, how do you develop norms that facilitate, constructive learning, not just academic learning, but also social emotional learning and growth, while also protecting, those that need protection and support, and that, may not be in the mainstream.
Yeah.
And I think it's really difficult. But we've been kind of following this pattern of, okay, here's our norms, but we're going to have a larger overriding norm. And that is, if our norms aren't working, we're going to just call it out.
Yeah,
we're going to talk about it. And we're going to see if our norms aren't working because we're not holding ourselves accountable to it, or when our norms aren't working because they're just not the right norms, or they're not norms that are facilitating our conversation. So I think being really intentional on a day-to-day basis by what are the really the explicit norms and agreements within our community that we're going to adhere to, and then what are also the implicit ones, the ones we're not talking about but that exist, that are impacting us, and being able to just have that difficult conversation about them.
Can you give an example of an explicit and an implicit norm?
I think an explicit norm that we've held in most of my classes is that learning looks different, or participation, looks different for everyone. So you're going to give what you can give that day.
Yeah.
And then the implicit norm that maybe might align with that is I shouldn't be playing games on my phone if I have my phone available, right? But so we haven't explicitly said no phones in our classroom, or I'm not going to play on my phone. But if I'm giving what I can give that day, there should be an implicit norm that goes along with that if I'm going to engage with what we're doing around us.
Yeah. I so like that too, because it comes back to this idea of talking about the bigger purpose when you try to teach kids, and it drives them crazy. I don't know if you have, you have kids, right? Of your own. My kids go crazy when you're like, just tell us what you want us to do. And it's like, no, I want you to understand why, or like see the bigger picture. So when you say to someone, I want you to engage your community, they're like, what does it even mean? And you're like, no, I just want you to get off your phone. It's like, it's much more, specific, but that's not the goal. It's not about being on your phone. It's about you are not engaging with your community. And that's an important value we hold.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to what Christian said about, values to behaviors to results.
Right.
And the norms themselves might be the values you hold, but with every norm, there's an actual action that occurs, or an inaction maybe in some cases.
Yeah, exactly.
So like, here's my norm, but this is like one action I'm going to take with it, or one inaction, something I'm not going to do. So maybe the norm might be I'm going to participate to the extent that I can that day. And then the action might be, hey, maybe I'll ask a question or ask how somebody's day is today. The inaction might be, I'm going to keep my phone away because I want to engage with the people around me.
And I think that would be a powerful exercise to actually just map that out. I think Christian just created like a whole worksheet and framework here you could use of like belief, behavior, result, right? If we want the result of an inclusive community and we believe that all students can succeed, what are those action and inactions that connect those two things, right? So I like that idea of having values dictate behaviors, which lead to results. And I almost wonder if that could be like a practice that you do with kids of like, what are the values that we hold? What are the results we want? What are the actions or inactions in between that connect those two things? And I think sometimes the inaction can be as dangerous as an action. Like you're going to hear somebody make a comment at school that's derogatory, that's hurtful. You believe, or you hear that happen. You're not going to do anything about it. There's an inaction that occurs. You're not going to call that out. That's not connecting your belief, and all students should feel like they belong to the results you want of an inclusive community. So the inaction is actually breaking that connection, and the inaction can almost be as negative as an action.
And I think the framework that I put together, anytime that I'm in a consulting space or if I'm in a teaching space, right, is I want them to have 3 entry points in that conversation. Okay. And so the question that I ask is like, what would our ideal school culture look like? For a mentor group, what's the ideal look like, right? We have 180 days together.
165 for us, but yeah.
165, whatever we'd like to.
We have a 15-day waiver, just gonna throw that out
there. How can you get the most awesome out of this, right?
Totally.
Like, what does the ideal look like? How do we want to be held? When we make mistakes, what does it look like to call ourselves back in, right? And we walk through like, what's the ideal look like? The second question that I asked them is, how does that differ from the current space that we're in, and how much does that cost us? Right? Yeah. And so, if we said that we wanted to look this way, right, and we also realize that there are some actions that are not, so it becomes a game of start, stop, continue, right? Like, what things do we need to start doing that we're not currently doing? What things do we need to stop doing that we know is having harmful impact on the community? And what do we need to amplify that we're already good at as a group? And the last thing that I ask is like, what are our actions? Like, what do they need to look like? And so I think that there's the results comes from the space of ideal. And as the facilitator of that or the mentor in that space, I don't get to determine ideal for you. You said it, right? So then how do we live up to? I think the action space and the current space gets at the behaviors. Then ultimately, if we get down to the beliefs, like you said that we could be this, right? So like, why not? And I'm not batting 1,000, right? But I'd say about 8.5 out of 10 times, right? Because it gives students language to hold each other accountable, or even, right, if I'm working with adults, as we develop community, if we've named these as norms, if we've named these as non-negotiables, right, people will be respected in this space. I think it also provides space for students. My favorite is when students check each other. You know what I mean? Right? Yeah. Like, and not check, I guess check is maybe not, no, I'm gonna use the word check. Right? They check each other, right? Because they realize that the value of our community and the threat of our culture is more important than this single interaction.
Right.
And it will cost us too much if I let that behavior continue. And so then as the facilitator, the mentor in the space, like, I don't have to be, the finger waver, right?
And I think that's a critical component, because we can't be the finger waver. It has to be the students that are holding each other accountable for it to truly be a community.
Yep.
I think with that being said, you have to acknowledge that there is a power imbalance, and that the power imbalances in schools do have a major impact. But the idea that the students are the ones that are pushing this, facilitating this, because they want that community, and that's the community they want to be a part of, is really, I think, the key.
Yeah, and it's so powerful when kids are the ones holding each other accountable. I wonder, have you thought about, I just like Christian's idea of the start, stop, continue, like calling kids out in mentor group to say, what are the behaviors that we need to stop? What are the behaviors we need to start? And what are the ones we need to continue or amplify? Connecting those to the norms that we've all agreed on. This is what's going to help get us from that belief system to the actions and behaviors that will lead to the results we want.
But I think even just backing up a step, I know one of the challenges I've faced as a mentor is that students are so embedded in a system that they don't feel like works for them or supports them. Of how do you start kind of a mentor group or 9th grade when they join us and get them to believe that this system will work for them? Like, how do you build that trust in this system? That's one of the challenges I've faced as a mentor, is that you can have all the great intentions that you want. You can try to facilitate this. You can build this up. But from the get-go, kids have to believe that the system's going to support them and it's going to work for them.
And where does that start, do you think?
I think just like the STEM camp, I don't know. This isn't something that I've researched or ever looked into, but my guess is that it starts a long time before they ever get to us, and that a lot of the work that we're doing is repair.
Well, I guess what I mean is like, where does it start for them to start to trust the system? Like, how does that change?
I think it's creating that belonging. So, and making them feel like they belong. And I think that trust slowly comes over time.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I just think, like, to me, that's one of the primary jobs as a mentor, working with a mentor group. Like, you want to get to the point of kids holding each other accountable, but especially for ninth graders coming in that have been a part of a system that they have not felt welcomed or felt like they belong. The mentor's job is then to meet individually with each one of those kids and develop that trust with you as a mentor, which then slowly leads to, over time, okay, I can trust you. I have that connection with you. Now I can start to learn to trust the whole group because I know that you have my back.
And I think this is where the mentor group pods can really come into play too, because if they have a smaller community within the mentor group of upper class leadership who you have already established trusting relationship with, then they can start to build that through their peers as well.
Yeah. I think we solved it, Christian.
No, I don't think so. But I think that's a really good point, right? Because like, I think the game of community, and I think this is sometimes where we get in trouble at schools, is like, that's a game of consistency and not a game of intensity, right? Like, we can't get that done in a day or in a month or during Black History Month or API History, right? Like those things can't happen. We can't just like celebrate Girls in STEM for 3 weeks and, you know, like, let's show cool pictures of, but I think your point is, you know, and one of our, I use the term loosely, friends, right? And more, I think somebody that I've kind of grown fond of, but Jeremy Simler, right? Like, uses the term. He said, what does trust look like? He said, it's two things. It's just behavior over time.
Yeah.
Right. And I think if we can show up in that space consistently, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because, you know, we have students sometimes that, you know, like you talked about, the mistrust didn't start with us. And I think that, like, showing that I'm willing to repair it, not just once, but over time, I think is a value. And I think the coolest thing about mentor groups is, right, like, you get to follow that story. Yeah, I know you said 165, you're messing up my math, right? But if it was 180 days, you have 720 of them, right? And if you know that the first 180 is an investment, you know what I mean, for what's going to happen longer over time, I think that what makes the module special.
Right.
I don't know anywhere else in the world where I get 4 years to build community with people, right, intentionally, with the same leader or facilitator in front of me, other than maybe like an Avid program that may or may not continue. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think that there's a lot of value in what you're doing and how you're naming that, particularly for, you know, girls who I think are going to go and navigate very difficult spaces. So.
Yeah, and I think that's the power, is it's a 4-year long-term relationship. I don't know any other schools that do that, where it's like you have a semester, and how are you going to build trust and belonging in a semester in 3 months with Thanksgiving break and, you know, Monday off here and you miss this day, and like that long-term relationship over 4 years builds trust to the point where then they can start to take ownership and then pass that on to the ninth graders coming in.
Yeah. I'm thinking a lot about how it goes beyond just the mentor classroom or the mentor group session that we hold once a week, right? That mentorship extends not just with our own mentees, but also the mentorship within the school, because we do have small communities within each school. So being able to connect, you know, for me with, you know, girls that match my own identity, that can look up to me as a mentor and a role model, and knowing that I can connect with them maybe in a way that their mentor is, but also cannot, just because of the lack of shared identity. So I think that understanding the impact that we can have as mentors in all of those roles that we play in our school is really important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool.
You know, Jen, it's been awesome having a conversation with you. I've appreciated the really important points that you've illuminated for us, and I thank you for like the work that you're doing long term. Right, I think it's so special to be able to plant seeds in a particular community and then to watch them grow. I know that the STEM camp is going to be amazing. I'm trying to figure out when my daughter can sign up for it.
Sign her up.
Right.
We'd love to have her.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for the work that you're doing in our community. And I hope that we get to talk to you again soon.
Likewise. Thanks, Christian. I'm really grateful to be here.
Thanks, Jen. Cool. Elements of Education is a 501c3 nonprofit organization in Tacoma, Washington, dedicated to changing public education to better serve the specific and diverse needs of students in our public schools. For more information about how you can support the work that we do, please visit elementsofed.org, or you can find us on Instagram at Elements of Education or on our website,